What we also know, we can also see that God is starting to provide what we call prevenient graces. These are graces that come before the grace that he plans on giving. He starts preparing things along the way. And what is that we're actually seeing? Well, inside the church, one of the reasons they're becoming more draconian is because they lost the intellectual argument. The modernists that are pushing all this stuff that's contrary to Catholic teaching have lost the intellectual argument. And as a result of that, because they've lost it, the only thing left, because they're in authority, is force. They don't persuade, they just are trying to force their way. We're going to make these things permanent. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. And they're very heavy-handed about it. And that's because that's all they have in the end. But that is always the sign of desperation, that they're coming to their end. The next 15 to 20 years, that'll play itself out to some degree, and it's going to be ugly in the church unless God intervenes beforehand, and it's going to be ugly in the church, but the shift is going to start happening because the younger clergy, many of them are much more solid and orthodox than their older counterparts. You talk to clergy, the priests, and they'll say, yeah, it's true. You see it coming. The first time I began to realize that they were going to start getting really draconian was the time I was reading this article by Richard McBrien. I wouldn't recommend it. But he was basically saying the fact that all these guys coming out of the seminaries are more orthodox is not a good thing. Oh, so having right belief is not a good thing. But he said, something needs to be done about it. Well, there it is. Right, that's what happens when your ideas are an abject failure and you haven't been able to persuade any people any longer, and so the only thing you can do is force it. We're seeing that both in the way our government is running things. They're not persuading us, they're just ramming it down our throats. $1.7 trillion? That's a boatload of money. I keep thinking to myself, man, that'd make 1.7 million people millionaires. That's a lot of money. So anyway, okay, so that being said, I don't want to get too much involved in politics. Quite frankly, because it's loathsome. All right. But the point being is that the clergy coming now are more solid and they desire to know the truth. You see this even among the young. They're attracted to Orthodox Catholic liturgy. They're attracted to Orthodox Catholic teaching. They're attracted to it. They don't have the baggage of their counterparts that are 50 or 60 or older. They have no attachments to the last 50 years. They just want to know the truth. I always tell people, one of the signs that this is another one of these parts of the elephant, I think this is the tail part, is we're living in a time warp. I tell people we're living in a time warp. They keep telling us you have to get with modern times. Okay, this is 2023, not 1960. The problems that you keep hearing these guys talk about in the church and the way they want the liturgy, they want all these things, it's like they're stuck in a time warp. Their liturgy's from the 60s, their vestments are from the 60s, their churches are from the 60s, their preaching is from the 60s, their music is from the 60s, and you can't get them out of it. They're just stuck there. Which tells you something, that the liturgy has to be perennial. It has to be eternal in the sense that it can appeal to every generation throughout time, independently of what's going on societally or in the church. That's a key thing. But the fact that they were stuck in this time warp is something that they just don't want to deal with. But that generation's getting older and it's dying out. And eventually, the people that are going to rise through the ranks, just because the only people going to be left are going to be the Orthodox priests. There'll still be bad ones. There always is going to be bad ones. But this is a sign that things are going to get better. But these priests are going to suffer a lot when they're young priests before anything really good is able to be done by them. As I mentioned, they're just going to be canceled. And I think as time goes on, the people running the church now are getting more and more concerned at the fact that, there's just not this attachment to the same thing that they have, the older people have an attachment to regarding, the 60s, etc. what happened in the 60s. I tell people, if you look at the definition of prudence, part of prudence is knowing your circumstances. And in order to know your circumstances, you have to have the virtue of circumspection. And it's one of the first virtues corrupted. Circumspection is the virtue which I keep track of my surroundings. Modern parlance, we call it situational awareness. But it's the virtue is called circumspection because I keep track of my circumstances. But St. Thomas says it's the first virtue corrupted. And how we know that? When people get angry, they lose all sight of the fact that they're standing in the grocery store line, and they start screaming and yelling at their kid, right? They're not thinking where they're at. That's an example of it. But when they were trying to tell us in the 1960s that modern man was different from all the predecessors, and so we had to have a new this and a new that and a new this and a new that, I'm like, really? In less than a generation before that, we just saw millions upon millions of people wiped out. Stalin wiped out 20 million people in the Ukraine. Mao wiped out 120 million people. Hitler wiped out millions. And modern man is somehow better and different from his predecessors? I don't think so. It was an elation. Oh, things are wonderful, things are wonderful. I don't know if it's some type of PTSD from going through the Second World War or what. But it was not, they didn't have a grasp on their circumstances.